Chapter 1. The First Stone. The air on 126th Street was thick with the scent of roasted peanuts and summer heat. It was an ordinary Tuesday, the kind of evening that settles over Harlem like a familiar blanket. Children played stickball in the street, their shouts echoing off the brownstones. Old men sat on stoops, nursing glasses of sweet tea, their conversation a low, rumbling hum that had been the neighborhood's soundtrack for 50 years. Inside the back room of a small tailor shop, the air was different. It smelled of stale cigar smoke, ink, and money. This was one of the dozens of nerve centers in Bumpy Johnson's kingdom, a numbers-running spot. It wasn't a place of violence. It was a place of hope, of community, a place where a dime bet on the right number could mean groceries for a week. The three men who entered didn't belong. They were young, their suits too sharp, their movements too loud. They weren't from the neighborhood. They carried themselves with the false confidence of men who mistake noise for power. The old man running the book, a man named Pops, had seen their kind before. 100 times. They came and they went. They didn't ask for money. They didn't draw weapons. The leader, a young buck with more ambition than sense, simply walked to the table where Pops kept his slips. He picked up the heavy ledger, the book that held the neighborhood's dreams and debts, a book Pops had kept under Bumpy's protection for 20 years. He didn't say a word. He just smiled, a thin, ugly thing, and tore a page out. Then another. He let the pieces of paper, covered in the careful handwriting of a trusted elder, flutter to the floor. His two men followed his lead, overturning the table, shattering the inkwell, pouring a bottle of cheap whiskey over the piles of betting slips. It was a calculated violation. Not a robbery, but a desecration. An act designed to say one thing: this place is no longer sacred. This man's protection is no longer absolute. Pops didn't move. He'd learned from Bumpy that the first man to lose his composure is the first man to lose the war. He simply watched them, his eyes holding the weight of decades. He knew this wasn't about him. It was a stone cast into a still pond, and the ripples were meant for one man. The young buck paused at the door, looked back at the old man sitting silently amid the ruin of his life's work, and gave a small, dismissive wave. It was a gesture meant to be seen, to be reported. A signal fire lit in the heart of Bumpy Johnson's territory. Chapter 2. A city hold its breath. Word travels fast in Harlem. Faster than the A train. More reliable than the evening news. By morning, everyone knew. The barbers sharpening their razors knew. The bakers dusting flour onto their counters knew. The women hanging laundry on fire escapes, their talk drifting down like soft rain, they knew. They spoke of the torn slips, the spilled ink. They spoke of the young buck's smile. They didn't speak his name. To do so would be to give him power. He was just the rival, a temporary storm cloud on the horizon. The real question, the one whispered in every bar and luncheonette, was not what had happened, but what would happen next. What would Bumpy do? And Bumpy did nothing. He woke at his usual hour. He dressed in a tailored suit, the fabric a quiet testament to his success. He had breakfast at the same corner diner he always did. The owner, a Greek man named Leo, brought him his coffee without asking. Black, 2 sugars. The cup didn't rattle in the saucer. Bumpy's hand was steady. He read the paper, folded it neatly, and left a tip that was precisely double the cost of his meal. Same as every day. He walked the streets. He didn't march. He strolled. His presence was a physical thing, a force of gravity that bent the world around him. He paused to watch the stickball game, offering a rare, small smile when a kid hit a sewer cap home run. He stopped at a fruit stand, discussing the quality of the peaches with the vendor as if it were the most important matter in the world. His men watched him, confused. Some of the younger ones, the hotheads, were vibrating with a need for action. An eye for an eye. A busted number spot for a busted head. That was the law they understood. But Bumpy's law was older, deeper. His calm was not an action. It was a statement. Retaliation was for lesser men, for those who had to prove their strength. Bumpy was proving his control. By refusing to be baited, he was dictating the terms of the conflict. He would not move to his rival's rhythm. The rival, and all of Harlem, would move to his. The city held its breath, waiting for a clap of thunder, and all Bumpy Johnson gave them was silence. A deep, heavy, and terrifying silence. Chapter 3. The Whisper Campaign. The rival, this upstart named Silas, had expected fire. He had planned for it. A street war was a chaotic, bloody affair, but it was a language he understood. Bumpy's silence, however, was a dialect he couldn't translate. It unnerved him. So he switched tactics. If he couldn't draw Bumpy's guns, he would try to poison his name. The attack began not with fists, but with whispers. Silas's men fanned out across Harlem, not as soldiers, but as gossips. In barbershops, where opinions were shaped with every cut of the razor, they'd talk just loud enough to be overheard. Heard Bumpy's getting on in years. Maybe he's tired. In the jazz clubs, where the night was liquid and secrets flowed as freely as the bootleg gin, they buy a round for the band and muse aloud. A man let someone mess with his business like that. Well, it makes you wonder. In the jazz clubs, where the night was liquid and secrets flowed as freely as the bootleg gin, they buy a round for the band and muse aloud. A man let someone mess with his business like that. Well, it makes you wonder. They spoke to the young men on the corners, the ones who saw Bumpy as a relic, a figure from another time. They flashed wads of cash, wore flashier suits, and preached a new gospel. The gospel of now. The old man's way is slow, they'd say. Respect don't buy you a Cadillac. Money does. The whispers were a disease. They didn't kill, but they weakened the body. They created doubt. For the first time in a generation, people began to question the foundation of their world. Bumpy's power was built on an unshakable belief that his protection was absolute, his authority final. Silas wasn't attacking the man. He was attacking the idea. Bumpy heard it all. Nothing moved in Harlem without his knowledge. He knew which of his men were listening to the whispers, their loyalty wavering. He knew which shopkeepers were starting to hedge their bets. He felt the subtle shift in the air, the slight hesitation in a nod of greeting, the glance that lingered a second too long. His own crew grew restless. We have to do something, Bumpy, his top lieutenant, a loyal man named Junie, urged. They're making you look weak. Bumpy sat in the back of the Palma Club, a chessboard in front of him. He slowly moved a pawn. Weakness, he said, his voice quiet but clear over the music, is screaming when you have nothing to say. Let him talk. A man with a full stomach doesn't need to tell everyone he's eaten. He was teaching a masterclass in power, but the lesson was slow, and his students were growing impatient. He was letting Silas build his own gallows, one rumor at a time. Chapter 4. The Public Challenge. The whispers were not enough. Silas saw that while he might have swayed the impatient and the greedy, the heart of Harlem, the old guard, the business owners, the families, remained loyal to Bumpy. Respect, he was learning, had roots deeper than his money could reach. He needed to force a confrontation. He needed to humiliate Bumpy in his own church. That church was Wells' restaurant on 7th Avenue. It was more than a place to eat. It was Bumpy's court. It was where he held meetings, brokered truces, and dispensed quiet justice. The staff were his people. The patrons were his subjects. To sit at Bumpy's table in the back was to have the ear of the king. That evening, Bumpy was there. He sat with Junie and 2 other senior men, enjoying a plate of chicken and waffles. The restaurant was full, the atmosphere warm and respectful. Then the door opened, and a chill followed. Silas entered, flanked by a dozen of his men. 50 other patrons and staff were in the room. Silas's crew were dressed to be seen, their expensive suits like costumes. They moved with a swagger that was alien to the quiet dignity of Wells. The hum of conversation faltered, then died completely. Forks and knives paused midair. Silas didn't approach Bumpy. That would have been a direct challenge, and he wasn't that foolish. Instead, he chose a table in the center of the room, a stage. They sat, they laughed too loudly, they ordered drinks with an arrogant snap of their fingers. It was a performance of disrespect. Bumpy did not acknowledge them. He continued his meal, his movements deliberate and unhurried. He was a stone in the middle of a river, forcing the water to move around him. This infuriated Silas. His performance was being ignored. He nodded to one of his men, a big, clumsy bruiser. The man stood up and walked toward the kitchen, taking a path that led him directly past Bumpy's table. As he passed, he stumbled, his arm knocking against Bumpy's table. A glass of water tipped, spilling a clear, cold pool across the white tablecloth, darkening the pristine linen. The bruiser mumbled a fake apology, a smirk playing on his lips. My mistake. The restaurant fell into a tomb like silence. This was it. The public desecration. Spilling water on Bumpy Johnson's table in the middle of Wells was like spitting on the altar during high mass. It was an act that could not be ignored. Every person in that room, 50 souls, understood that a line had been crossed. They weren't watching a man with a wet tablecloth. They were watching the precipice of a war. They all turned their eyes to Bumpy. His move would be Harlem's move. Chapter 5. The Weight of Silence. Time seemed to slow down. The drip of water from the table onto the floor was the only sound in a room of 50 frozen people. Bumpy Johnson did not look at the bruiser who had spilled the water. He didn't look at his own men, whose hands were inching toward the weapons hidden beneath their jackets. He looked at the puddle on the tablecloth. He watched it spread, a slow, dark stain on the white linen. He held the gaze of every person in that room by looking at nothing at all. He let the silence stretch, letting it build, letting it suffocate the arrogant confidence Silas had brought into the room. The air grew heavy, thick with the unspoken question. Now, after a lifetime, perhaps 10 seconds, Bumpy moved. He deliberately placed his fork on his plate. He took his napkin and dabbed at his lips. Then, slowly, he pushed his chair back and stood. He was not a large man, but in that moment, he seemed to fill the entire room. He didn't walk toward the bruiser. He walked toward Silas. He moved with a quiet, unhurried grace that was more menacing than any threat. The dozen men with Silas tensed. Some even shifted their weight as if to stand, but they found they could not. They were pinned to their seats by the sheer force of his presence. They were 50 men in total, rivals, patrons, staff, and every single one of them was held captive, completely still, by the approach of this one old man. Bumpy stopped at Silas's table. He didn't look at Silas. He looked at the half-eaten steak on his plate. Then he looked at the bottle of expensive champagne, cooling in a bucket beside him. Finally, he raised his eyes and met Silas's gaze. Bumpy's face was calm, almost placid. He didn't scowl. He didn't threaten. He just looked. And in that look, Silas saw the totality of his miscalculation. He saw the decades of violence, the alliances forged in blood and loyalty, the web of power that spread through every brick and sewer grate in Harlem. He thought he was challenging a man, but he was facing a city. When Bumpy finally spoke, his voice was so low it was almost a whisper, yet it carried to every corner of the silent room. "The tablecloth," he said, his voice smooth as worn leather, "is linen. Imported. The owner of this establishment, his daughter, is getting married next month. He uses his savings to make this place special, to make it nice." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. He wasn't talking about disrespect to himself. He was talking about a violation against the community. He then shifted his gaze slightly to the bruiser who'd spilled the water. "You," Bumpy said, not with anger, but with a chilling sense of finality. "Your name is Anthony. You live with your mother on 142nd Street. She plays the numbers every Wednesday. Her favorite is 427. She's a good woman." Anthony's face went pale. The smirk was gone, replaced by pure, cold fear. Bumpy's eyes returned to Silas. "There are rules," he said, his voice dropping even lower. "Rules to everything. To business. To life. You came into this neighborhood, and you thought that because you made noise, you had a voice. But all you have is an echo." He reached out, not violently, but with the precision of a surgeon. He picked up Silas's champagne bottle. He didn't smash it. He simply held it, his grip effortless. "You wanted my attention. You have it." He placed the bottle back on the table, the sound a soft thud that echoed like a gavel. "Get out," he said. It wasn't a command shouted in anger. It was a statement of fact, a dismissal. Silas and his men looked at each other, their bravado shattered. They stood up, their movements clumsy and hurried. They had walked in like conquerors. They scurried out like mice. They didn't look back. The room remained silent, frozen, until the door swung shut behind them. 50 men, released from a spell they didn't understand. Chapter 6. Echoes in the Concrete. The silence in Wells' restaurant held for a moment longer after Silas and his men were gone. Then, Bumpy Johnson turned back to his table. He looked at the owner, Leo, who was standing pale and rigid near the kitchen door. Bumpy gestured to the stained tablecloth. "Leo," he said, his voice back to its normal, conversational tone, "add it to my bill." Then he sat down. He picked up his knife and fork and calmly began to finish his chicken and waffles, as if nothing had happened. That single act, the return to normalcy, was the final assertion of his power. The storm had passed, not because it had been fought back, but because he had willed it away. Within a week, Silas was gone, not just from Harlem, but from the city. His operation crumbled overnight. The men who had followed him, drawn by his flash and noise, scattered to the winds. There were no bodies in the street, no turf war reported in the papers. Silas's empire had been built on the illusion of strength, and when Bumpy Johnson held up a mirror to it, the illusion shattered, and there was nothing left. The story of that night in Wells became legend. It was told in barbershops not as a whisper, but as a lesson. It was recounted by the old men on the stoops as proof that there was an order to their world. They didn't talk about the threat of violence. They talked about the weight of silence. They talked about a man knowing another man's mother's favorite number. It was a detail so specific, so intimate, it was more terrifying than a gun. Bumpy's restraint was not weakness. It was a weapon. By refusing to answer violence with violence, he had elevated himself. He had reminded his community, and any who would challenge him, that he wasn't just a gangster fighting for territory. He was a patriarch defending a way of life. His power didn't come from the gun in his pocket, but from the respect he commanded and the knowledge he held. He was part of the concrete and the steel of Harlem. Years later, long after Bumpy was gone, young men would still point to Wells' restaurant and tell the story. The story of how Ellsworth, Bumpy, Johnson made 50 men freeze with nothing more than a look and a few quiet words. He hadn't won a fight. He had demonstrated that for a man like him, some fights were never necessary. He had built a legacy not on the battles he had fought, but on the ones he had chosen not to.